Well, hello, this is Dr. Scott Langford, and I'm here with the Stanford Gen Channel and LGBTQ plus History Month at Foothill College, where I'm a professor of English. And I'm joined today by internationally celebrated author and journalist and radio personality and documentarian, Andrew Lamb, who is one of our most frequent and most popular guests as a guest author at Foothill College. Andrew, I'm afraid that we may have to give you tenure pretty soon.
I would love it.
The way things are going. But thank you for always being here at Foothill College. And we are in the midst of a really full and wonderful LGBTQ Heritage Month. I'll just kind of scroll past some of the things that we've done already, including fantastic Cooking with Nikki and Queer Art History this week. And so now we're down here for Andrew Lamb, and tomorrow we're going to have a couple queer poets from San Francisco State joining us. So Andrew, thank you for being here. And I'll just say one or two more words before I let you get a word in edgewise. One is that my class in LGBTQ Lit, which is meeting right now, and students will be joining us either live or later, did read several of Andrew Lamb's short stories from his ever wonderful and amazing short story collection, Birds of Paradise Lost, and which has been assigned by so many of my colleagues. So I'm just one of many of Andrew's fans in the English department. And that's one reason we've had him back so often, because it's not just my classes that love reading his stories, it's many of our classes. He really is just, he's our go-to author in many cases. And then at this point, just to sort of wrap up my intro, I know that Andrew has a new collection of short stories coming out, which we are all desperately looking forward to reading. And I also know that although Andrew frequently has lately been joining us live from Saigon, this time he's back in his home in San Francisco. And so partly what we want to talk about is the pandemic restrictions, what's going on sort of with gay life and queer life in San Francisco, in Vietnam, how are things changing? Those are two topics. There we go. So Andrew, first let me just say hello and let you get a word in edgewise, and then I'll throw out my first question for you.
Okay.
All right. So my students are always interested, and I'm always happy because I know you, when you immigrated, you ended up in Daly City, my hometown in California. So could you tell us a little about your rather amazing and to some degree somewhat unlikely journey to become a writer who is published and wins awards and does these kinds of talks on 3 or 4 continents every year?
Well, not lately.
Well, at least 2 lately, because I know you've been giving talks in it. Well, by virtually in Zoom this year.
In Zoom, yes.
In Zoom, but you have continued your fabulous career in Zoom, because I've seen that.
But I was a refugee from Vietnam at the end of the war, and I was about 11 going on 12. And I had no intention of coming to America that I knew of. My family really weren't prepared to leave Vietnam either. So coming to America was a bit of a shock to the system, and being forced out by, being loser side of the war was something that continued to traumatize us, over 4 decades later, because there's nothing like having lost a whole country, and having to recover and to remake yourself. So yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, I didn't think of myself ever was going to be a writer. But the one thing that I look back was that I had always loved reading, first in Vietnamese and French, and then in America, I started reading in English exclusively. But I was an obedient kid, so I follow family dictum. And basically, my brother is going to be an engineer, my sister was going to be a business woman, and I was going to be a doctor. It's sort of like assigned homework. And so I got into Berkeley, and I was going to study. I was studying biochemistry. In fact, I have the degree still somewhere around here, in biochemistry, working in a cancer research lab, preparing myself for medical school. And something along the way happened, which is something that does happen a lot to young people who leave home for the first time. And in my case, I fell in love. I fell deeply in love with um, a boy who went on to break my heart. And later on marry a woman, but that's another story. And but because of that, I thought, I am not prepared for this heartbreak. I don't know how to process it, and so I started while in my senior year, I guess. I started taking extension courses in creative writing. And after I graduated, I was working daytime in a cancer research lab. But at night, I started writing about this great love of mine, which there was only one at that time, but it was great. And it was terrible because it had ended. And there were, I was not making much progress in it. And in retrospect, I think because if you are in the middle of heartbreaks, you don't really have a framework because you haven't hit the ground, so you don't know how far the extension of the fall is, to give it a kind of retrospective look, you know what I mean? But I did find in revisiting it, months or a year later of the writing, and it was all about the heartbreak, was that I say something along the line of, if you love someone and share a life with that someone, a private language with that someone, and when you lose that someone, you basically have become an exile. In fact, you have lost an entire country. And upon rereading that passage, I started to weep. I mean, weep. and it occurred to me that I actually had a broken heart before, but I didn't know it. That I, at the age of 11, the little kid who stood in the refugee camp in Guam, listening to the BBC announcing the end of the Vietnam War and not knowing what had happened to my relatives, my father, the house, the dogs, the neighbors, I was petrified. And I was mourning a lost world, but didn't know it. So when I got to America, I ran fast and furious and became this American kid, but I never processed this great loss. And so I fell in love with this someone who actually came from my neighborhood in Vietnam. And I met in high school, in fact, was that it was a revisit to all the losses. And when I lost this person, it became a watershed moment. And so instead of just mourning this person or this great love that had given me shelter in a world where I was very confused, I started writing about what it was like to lose a country, what had happened to the people who left and who deal with this life in exile and the language barriers and the shame and the humiliations and the violence and so on. And then I started finding a voice that I wasn't just gonna write about myself anymore, but I was writing about a broken people and not just my broken heart. And slowly I found my way into the creative writing department of San Francisco State, where within the same semester, I would say, I was quote unquote discovered by the great writer Richard Rodriguez, who somehow had not stolen, but someone from my class had given my essay to Richard to read. Richard and my boss at that later on at Pacific News Service, about what it's like to be a refugee kid, in America. And that changed everything because they reached out to me. They wanted me to write. They say, your voice is unique. And, mind you, this was 1989, 1990. So we want you to participate in this sort of like forum of new voices in America. And I thought, why me? I just got into creative writing, and I was going to write novels. I wasn't going to write essays, but, lo and behold, within a year, I was hired, and I started writing pieces that got syndicated through the AP Wire and was picked up all the way from Washington Post to, Baltimore Sun to, Philadelphia Tribune and the Chronicle. And I sort of like became a syndicated writer for a while, which to me was shocking. And then a few years later, NPR was interested in having me as a regular commentator. So the weird thing and the lesson is that just go down the road and, with passion, and doors will open, I guess, and that's what happened.
Yeah, and I always like to say that, to some degree, I sort of, quote unquote, met you through NPR.
Yeah.
In fact, we just interviewed Sandeep Roy last week.
Yeah.
And you both worked in New American Media. And
Yeah.
I always like to point out to my students that Andrew Lamb, Sandeep Roy, two of the guests that we had this week, and several other of their colleagues just kind of shattered the glass ceiling that had kept people of color out of even public radio. And I still think that was one of your great contributions, Andrew.
Oh, thanks.
And I mean, really, and I'm never going to shut up about it, because I think it helped. I think it literally helped change journalism and radio journalism permanently, I hope, and forever. And you were there. You were the one banging your head against that glass ceiling. But I have, from the outsider perspective, at least, I have at least some idea of how thick that glass was.
Yeah. There was a lot of resistance.
How important those voices were. It's one reason I was really listening.
Yeah.
When your voice started to appear on the radio, was like, whoa, okay, here's a new voice with a new perspective, with deep roots in a community that should have been covered all along. Yeah. Right. And so I think that was another thing that really made you stand out as like in what Richard Rodriguez did for you, you did for other writers, and still do. It's one reason we have you back, because you're good at encouraging young writers. So there we go.
So I think that answered your question.
Well, it did. Although, so here's two other afterthoughts. One is, and I didn't ask you about this ahead of time, so you can always edit out the question later if you want.
Yeah.
But since I follow your Facebook, and since I'm also from Daly City these days, although, right now I'm in Denver. And so it's all very complicated, but I still think of my adopted home as Daly City. I am able to screen. I thought that the photographs of your family that you posted today, you've been posting many, many photographs of your own past and your family's past. And I thought that the photographs really spoke to another element of your experience, which was that your father, who was a military general, and you were from an upper class and rather wealthy family in Vietnam, so hardly struggling. You had quite a privileged upbringing. Then landed flat in the U.S. with nothing.
Yeah, top of the hill, Daly City.
But your father was amazing. Like so many other Vietnamese immigrants of his generation. Man, the work ethic and the brilliance and everything. So he really created a middle-class life for you in Daly City. And I thought those photographs actually really helped me understand that. So thank you for posting those.
Sure. I think that the other element of becoming a writer for me was that unlike other people of my generation, they were struggling economically. And by the time I graduated from Berkeley, even though I decided not to become a doctor as my parents had hoped for, I was not needed in terms of an economic need in my family, because my father by then was already a bank executive, and so we were already in the suburb of Milpitas in this 5-bedroom home with a pool. So things were looking up, and we vacationed in Europe. And that was not true with my Vietnamese American classmates at Berkeley, because some were just, both people who came over by themselves and were struggling to work part-time to send money home, and I think that was one of the major reasons why I didn't feel this pressure to become a doctor, because there was no one needing me to sort of provide. I was also the youngest, so I got away with a lot, you know.
You always get away with a lot, Andrew.
Yeah.
I think that's partly your personality. And of course, that's part of what you write about in many. So I kind of tried to shorten my usual too long intro because
Yeah.
Andrew was actually very challenging to introduce.
Yeah.
So two things that I usually say that I would like to add is that you did do, in addition to the NPR, then you did a PBS documentary series,
Yeah.
returning to Vietnam, and now you have again returned. Although right now you're joining us from San Francisco.
Yeah.
So there is this. So that there's this kind of like always returning
Yeah.
and seeing Vietnam as a boy growing
Yeah.
up in a privileged family, seeing Vietnam again as a PBS award-winning journalist, taking the documentary cameras and all of the United States along with you some years ago, and then more recently returning and writing and speaking and
teaching
once
in
again giving
Vietnam.
us a new window. And now here I am. Last time I talked to you, the pandemic had just started.
Yeah.
And now we have a new window, which is
Yeah.
you're locked out of Vietnam by biochemistry, I might add. I think biochemistry is taking some bizarre revenge.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? But do you have a question?
Well, yeah, I do. So I am very interested in updates, right?
Yeah.
Like, and here we are. I mean, we're here for Pride Month. We're here for LGBTQ Heritage and History Month. And I think I'm very interested in how you, from your perspective currently in San Francisco, and from your more recent perspective, having relocated back to Saigon for quite some time, how you're seeing sort of the evolution of both the pandemic in both countries. So you have a dual perspective. You have that, you have that famous double consciousness thing in two ways. Like, so you've seen the pandemic on two continents, in two very different countries, and you've seen sort of queer life from the inside out on two continents too. And I'm sort of interested in the overlap.
So how do I put this? Well, I came back to Vietnam to live at least a part-time out of the year. I had planned to go back and forth until the pandemic, put an end to that plan. But so I moved back to Vietnam in 2018 in the summer. And the one thing that I discovered was that Vietnam was much more open regarding homosexuality, especially in big cities like Hanoi or Da Nang or Saigon, than Vietnamese in America by far. Vietnamese in America tend to come from older conservative communities that left in the 70s and late 80s toward the late 80s, and many had carried, old world view and conservatism. But the world of Vietnam is full of young people. I think 2 out of 3 is under 34. So their attitude towards sex in general, it's a lot more open and fluid than you would imagine. And so, for instance, I was amazed to see a TV show hosted by a transgender woman who had won a beauty pageant, and now she's openly gay, and she interviewed conservative and liberal people and asked them about their point of view and argue with them on TV. And I was amazed by that, and there are young people who are making cheap but pretty entertaining YouTube series that are very, very enterprising, very surprising, and very open. For instance, one of the things I did follow back 2-3 years ago was about this soccer team where 2 boys fell in love even though they had girlfriends. And so the acting was not very good because everything is done cheaply on YouTube. But the idea is there, that, hey, I can change my mind. I'm gonna fall in love with my best friend instead of my girlfriend, and that sort of thing. And it has a lot of viewers, you know what I mean? And then all these dating apps, far more available than in the US. I mean, dating apps in Vietnam, it ranged from, just texting to sharing video to commercial, so they sell products and stuff as well. A lot of prostitution, obviously, online. But and when you read this stuff online, you're amazed by the openness about sexuality. Like it feels like practically half the city is sleeping with the other half. And
rather like San Francisco, I might add. But
but San Francisco is pretty dead now. You know what I mean? Like the last few years, there was really, it feels like because of the wealth and it drove out the young energy of the place. I talk to Castro friends who are in their 50s, and they say, oh, there's nothing happening here. If you want something fun, you have to move to Sacramento. Because San Francisco, even though it sort of like had that spirit, in reality, because of the tech companies and the expensive rent and so on, it drove away the young dynamic and the creativity of place, which is not true of Saigon. It has like 12 million people. And every year there's like 200,000 or 300,000 more people coming in from the rural. So they add to this sort of vibrant craziness of place,
This is a great, it's a great answer. And of course, I, like almost all longtime San Franciscos, have complained about exactly this. The gentrification, of San Francisco, and the absence of what, and sometimes you wonder if it's just in your own head.
Yeah.
That nostalgic for the quote unquote good old days. But I do hear what you're saying. And it's isn't it fascinating how the tables have turned in exactly this way? Now, so did the pandemic initially didn't hit Vietnam hard, and that was part of the headlines, right? And now there's a bit of a shutdown. So can I ask for a little bit of update in terms of what's going on with COVID, and also how that's affected how you seem to, can you see from here that there's been any impact on life?
A lot. A lot of things has happened. First of all, I was planning to come back last March, which didn't happen because my flight got canceled. I was supposed to travel to Europe, that got canceled, and so on and so on. And so I was technically stuck for a year and a half in Vietnam without being able to go anywhere. But during that time, Vietnam managed to control the pandemic really well. And it's oddly to say, but it's in part because it's a police state, so they can really contact trace everybody, and if you are found positive, you better tell them who you've been in contact with, or you'll be in trouble, right? So in a way, people are very good at telling it all, who they've been with. And once they do know, like for instance, there was a steward who escaped from quarantine too early, and he turned out to be positive, and he hung out with a teacher, and then the teacher is a gay couple, and the teacher went to teach, and then next thing you know, the building is quarantined. All the students were also quarantined. Vietnam does not take this thing lightly. So because the other thing is that it does not have infrastructure to deal with 100% capacity, because they don't have the breathing apparatus, they don't have the medicine that necessarily to save people's lives. So the prevention, it's best medicine, so it takes this thing very seriously. And so until the fourth wave, it managed to control a flare up each time within 3 weeks. Wow. And until then, there were only 36 deaths in the country out of 96 million people. But now that number is changing very fast because the new variant was so contagious. And, and it was also because, strangely enough, has to do with Vietnam's own success. What happened was, because other countries were shut down, big companies like Apple started moving industries over from China to Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And so it required workers very quickly. And so Chinese follow, and they cross the border illegally in order to work in those factories and so on. And they're the one that started infecting the locals. And even though Vietnam sent an army literally to go along the Laotian, Cambodian, and China's borders to prevent people from coming in and punish coyotes quite harshly, like 5 years in prison and so on, and expensive fines. But people need money, and they still do these things. And so it's because of that the infection started up again, which is unfortunate. Right now, Vietnam has less than 1% vaccinated, or maybe 1% vaccinated. Like every other struggling poor country, they don't have enough access to vaccines, even though promises are coming. And the Biden administration just yesterday promised like 500 million doses, but that's to the rest of the world, not to Vietnam, right? India especially is like a drowning place. So and Vietnam tried to fundraise to buy vaccines, and desperately they're also getting stuff from China and Russia, which they prefer not to, but I don't think they're given a choice right now, So they have to step up on the vaccination, because they cannot keep themselves isolated for way too long, because I can see sectors that are suffering. Tourism is dead, and you walk through this we call it the Balo Street, which is people carrying backpackers street. It's empty. It's like a mortuary, and that used to be the most vibrant part of the city because of tourism, and that's gone, right? And people who live off that kind of industry, they're desperate because there is no other jobs for them, so people are running back to the rural trying to survive, but and yet there are other industries that are doing really well, because Vietnam produce gloves and masks and so on. And so, and they're putting iPhones together now. So that industry is picking up, that sort of thing.
That's fascinating. Well, let me ask you one more question about current life in Vietnam. And we do want to get around to your writing, because my queer lit class is here and we were reading your stuff. And we do really want to hear about what you're writing these days and what's coming out new. But one more question I want to ask, and I actually don't know the answer to this one at all. What's the situation between, you mentioned the situation for trans and gender fluid people in Vietnam. Yeah. Is there that kind of divide or wall between lesbian and gay men, lesbian women and gay men? As you know, in the old days in San Francisco, which I loathe, but it was there. I mean, it was a fact. It was unfortunate. It was a very unfortunate and horrible fact of life. Yeah. That for a long time, lesbians and gay males in San Francisco, quote unquote, didn't mix, and it was mostly sexism on the male side, by the way. And I don't know if there's a similar sort of dividing line in Vietnam, or if there was, and it's mostly come down, which I hope I can say for San Francisco. But what's the situation in terms of women? And I know you're, of course, having to look as an outsider, of course, but like, what's your impression of the situation for
so there's something different about Vietnam, is that while in the US, gayness is a political identity and you can organize accordingly, in Vietnam, there is no political identity because of the one-party systems. So you cannot like form a political activist group, of any kind, not just gay, lesbian, but any kind, right? Or minority or whatever it is, because of the fear that it will become a movement that undermine communist parties, right? And so because of that, queer identity are strictly on the private and cultural level, by which I mean there is no one place where people gather. There is no like LGBTQ headquarter or any that sort of thing, right? And there's not even like there used to be more, but like there's not even really a one place that is designated as a gay cafe or a gay club or anything like that. There's a lot of bathhouses, but that's different. That's under the health rubric, but in terms of like gathering and talks and stuff like this, and this is not about not doing the worst of the pandemic, but what I'm saying is like if there is a gay gathering, it's word of mouth,
Okay. Yeah.
So you go to certain coffee shop because between 4 to 7 p.m., a lot of gay people hang out, both lesbian and gays and so on, because it's known to be owned by a gay man, right? But no one say it's a gay place. You know what I mean?
But what's interesting in that answer is then, like, so there is mixing between gay men and lesbian
Yeah,
women at these gathering places.
Yeah.
Because in the old days in San Francisco, and you'll remember, there were sort of the lesbian cafes over in the Mission, and
Yeah,
the
I remember.
male cafes over in the Castro. And there really was this, I always remembered me and my poor naive first boyfriend, like stumbling quite accidentally and friendly into a lesbian cafe, a famous lesbian cafe in the Mission on Valencia Street, and not knowing that we're sort of quote unquote not supposed to be there, right?
Yeah, not only that, but I think the division here is even more severe because it's not just gay and lesbian, but the transgender club was not also very welcome of gays.
Yes, exactly.
So I remember stumbling into transgender club and people say, we don't want your kind here. And I thought,
and vice versa. I mean, that was partly because
I know.
it was
but I was like, wow, so talk about a lack of unity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in principle, there's unity, but in action, maybe not. And so it's I remember like, wow, being discriminated by transgender people. But yeah, in Vietnam, it's not so obvious. I mean, the discrimination is still from straight toward gay and queers and so on. But I think in the rural, it's a lot worse because things haven't changed much in the rural. And in fact, people, don't just they don't come out so much as they flee from home, sometimes. Because, for instance, when you're in the rural, 17, 18, you're expected to get married. Life is tough. And so if you're a lesbian or gay, and your parents say, you got to marry, you either marry and make everyone else suffer along with you, or you run to the city and say, I have to work to support you. And so I need to be away, that sort of thing, so that happens a lot. Instead of coming out, there is no real coming out political message either. It's more like, oh, I have to, because otherwise they will make me marry, this woman, or that sort of thing.
Yes. Okay, well, that's a really interesting answer also. Now, why don't you let us, so I would like to invite you to tell us a little bit about this very exciting forthcoming collection. And you've always been generous. I have a little preview because you've always been generous and shared with me things that are, things that are still kind of in manuscript or things like that. So, but I would love to hear where you're at with this, with the new collection, and how you, particularly since the students have read, my students at least that are with us, so have read several of the stories. And they actually sneak off and read all of them often, by the way. We'll have read several of the stories in your short story collection, Birds of Paradise Lost. So how you perceive this new collection as being different from, or not, from Birds of Paradise Lost?
Yeah, so when I wrote Birds of Paradise Lost, I, had extra stories that felt too repetitive in theme with other stories. And so through a painful process of elimination, they were not, included in Birds of Paradise Lost. So I decided after a year or so, decided to build a new collection out of the few pieces that were not included. And over time, they become very obvious to me that if Birds of Paradise Lost were the stories dealt very much with like the trauma of being people who were forced out, both people experiences. This collection tentatively called Stories from the Edge of the Sea, in part because there's so many stories that has ocean or water in it. And they deal with sort of second generation, more people who either grew up here or were born here, dealing instead of the war or the refugee experience. The majority deal with the aftermath long after the fact, but in terms of love, relationship, and family dynamics, and lust. So I called it Love, Lost, and Lust narrative, but with Vietnamese American in California. But so those are the stories, and I'm 90% done. Shopping around because it's so hard to find a publishing house right now, especially post-pandemic, or I guess we're not post yet, but coming out of one. People are, publishing houses are more willing to publish novels than short stories. I mean, short stories were never really that money making before, but it's even worse now. So I'm sending it to several publishing houses that I know, and so hoping for some bite, I guess. But we'll
Well,
see.
sure. And I mean, I have to say again, when you started publishing, I know that you entered a creative writing program thanks to Richard Rodriguez.
Yeah.
And after you left biochem, and I know that you initially thought of yourself as someone who would write fiction, and then only sort of migrated into journalism,
Yeah.
including at Stanford.
Yeah.
But then I guess where I'm trying to get with this is that your career in fiction is a long one, but I didn't know that until you published Birds of Paradise Lost. So I was gobsmacked because I already had, having lived in San Francisco as an English professor for some decades now, I've gotten a little bit used to like, okay, well, this friend's book is doing wonderfully in this genre, and this friend's, and I'm not the jealous type, so I'm applauding, but I was a little bit, okay, he's done PBS documentaries. He's an NPR radio celebrity. He writes amazing and beautiful nonfiction essays and memoirs, which we also assign at Foothill College. And now he's writing short stories.
No, I always wrote short stories.
And they're winning, and they're getting all of this major attention in ways that short stories, nobody's short stories get attention like that for the most part. It really was. It was wonderful to see, and a testament to how great the stories are.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by the reception, at least in academia. So for 2 years, I kept traveling because of it. Of the collection, which took a lot of energy out of you. But in any case, I see a lot of my friends now, they only travel by Zoom when they have their books out. And I was like, in a way it's good, in a way it's bad, because you cannot really be there, so there's no energy. On the other hand, traveling is very taxing when you do a book tour. But in any case, I'm hoping to get this collection now because I have a lot of other ideas for stories, for books, but there was something that you just got to get it out of your system. So I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm kind of happy about that.
Well, that's fantastic. And we hadn't discussed this in advance. We would love, of course, to hear if you want to do any readings, either from the current collection or the prior collection. It tends to be a feature.
I'll do a piece that was published. How much time do we have though?
Well, let's see. It's 3. I'm in Denver time, so it's 3:15. Maybe what we should do is let's pause for a second, Andrew, and see if any of the students, faculty, staff who are in the room with us would like to ask questions.
Yeah.
And there's 2 ways to do that. Let me mention. So we have had everyone muted because that's in the world of Zoom. But we could either unmute you to ask your question, or we can read your question if you type it into the chat. So I think you can start by typing it into the chat, either saying, I'd love to ask a question, and we'll unmute you, or you can type your question in and let us know whether you
grab some water
to read it. Yeah, that's fine. So if you're interested in asking a question, now is one of the times that you might get to do so. And you've all watched me long enough to know that I'm always full of too many questions. Plus, I could stop being my windy self and listen to Andrew read, which I always enjoy. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat over here at the same time, which I'm not always good at as a Zoom host. But at least at the moment, Andrew, I'm not seeing anyone raising their hand. You can also use the reactions button to raise your hand in Zoom land, and you'll know how that works. Looks like you get to read, Andrew, which is good. I really would like to make time for that within the hour or two. So I think since hands aren't flying up, which is fine, why don't we go ahead and have you read a short selection?
Okay.
And I think for me as a literature teacher, and I know that many of my literature students will be coming in later asynchronously to this event. So I really would like them. I'd like them to hear you read some of your own work. Yes.
Okay. So why don't I read this piece, and if it's too long, you can stop me.
Okay.
It's 1900 words, so. It's published a while back. It's called The Shard, the Tissue, and Affair. Not that the class shard had any business with the sole of his foot. Nevertheless, it made itself familiar and it was an unending story of how he teased and squeezed and how it refuted his negotiations. But finally, the shard, so small, smaller than a tiniest teardrop, was retrieved, and he, pained still, examined it for a brief moment against the halogen lamp before flicking it to her like a comet out my window. On my bed, he sat, a teary-eyed Shiva, his wounded foot raised in the air, kicking, kicking. I should have swept carefully. This was no way to welcome a poet. I should have mobbed, waxed, something. Now I watch as he wiped the wound with a tissue paper and felt awkward like a caught voyeur. But then he looked up and smiled. Come here, he sighed. We had seduced each other over the phone and via emails a year before we actually met. An essay of mine had found its way to his part of the world, and he took the initiative of sending me an email full of compliments. I replied, thanking him for his kind words, and discreetly enclosed my number. He called, we talked, mostly of home, of our tropical Vietnamese childhood. He named for me seasons half forgotten, our childhood fruits eaten in stealth and ecstasy. Remember the green mango, sweet and sour and crunchy, eaten with salt and red chili pepper or even fish sauce, hidden under the student's desk while an old geezer of a teacher droned on. And the durian, loved of yellow brains, eaten with glee by the entire family after dinner, fingers digging through a split thorny shell the size of a skull. Family brain surgery, that's what it was, a ceremony of shared flesh. And what a smell! Rotten flesh fragrance, its pungent aroma remaining for days in your hair, your nostrils, your breath, and the milk apple, green and purple outside, milky white inside, to be eaten after siesta, its cool and smooth texture sliding against your throat like sweet ice. Afterwards, washing the milky sap off your lips, scrubbing real hard and see how raw they look in the mirror, as if from too much kissing. I in turn recounted for him the flame trees that blossomed in the courtyard of my elementary school, red and green, glowing to the point of blindness under an unforgiving sun, its black fruits, hard shells that fit perfectly in a child's palm, turning into swords for the boys to duel with. I recall a summer villa veiled in a cloud of red bougainvillea by the ocean in Nha Trang, the way I slept in the afternoon on the second floor, soundly insulated in the parents' rhapsodic laughter, which echoed like shattered crystals from room to room, and how I loved the roaring sound of waves out the tall French windows that made me dream of tigers. My favorite childhood smells, the sea, of course, with faint suggestions of kelps and dead fish, ripened rice field at dusk, my grandmother's eucalyptus ointment to ward against evil winds, the sweetness of sandalwood incense burned by my pious mother nightly. On the phone late one afternoon, I whispered, read me a poem. Out on the bay, the foghorn wailed mournfully. A poem, please. I don't know, he said. You were supposed to send a photo, remember? I'm sorry, I'll send one tomorrow, I swear. Poem, please. Read. Okay. Leaving. Mother burns pages of albums, wedding day, first child, father's funeral, Ted. Quick, she says, hurry, prepare. We'll sail away downriver to sea. Saigon in April, a season of smoke. His poetry went on to speak of a perilous journey, one full of wonders and griefs. So I took my chance. Will you come for a visit to your city, he asked. Of course, I say, by the sea. You can see sailboats every morning out my window. Hear the cable cars go rumbling, clanging by. Feel the sea breeze on your skin, taste its salt. To fall in love is to have one sense of geography grafted onto another's, no matter how tenuous, so as to form a new country. I saw Houston in my mind, a city of strip malls, grand old homes, and gleaming glass and steel skyscrapers that coexist cheek by jowl. He in turn imagined San Francisco with its Trans-America pyramid poking the blue sky, windblown hills the color of ember at twilight, sailboats gliding on the bay like playful white butterflies. He imagined, and I could tell this from his voice, that there was freedom somewhere in the next valley. All right, he said, I'll come in December at the beginning of winter. Then he stepped on a shard and had trouble walking the next day. His new boots, bought a week before, unyielding, his dye-stained socks kept sliding down the inside. He walked the city, my city, with the slightest of limb. We were otherwise chirpy as songbirds that first day. At lunch, we held hands under the table at Cafe Glade while I introduced him to friends. And afterward, walking home, we broke into an old folk song about rice harvesting, a song learned so long ago and so meaningless now that neither one of us knows its lyrics entirely. Day 2, to Carmel. I drive, my hand resting sporadically in his Caesarea Evora cooing as nostalgic ballads of love. Last night, under a flapping red awning of a stucco apartment building somewhere on Russian Hill, we kissed and I impulsively beckoned him to move in with me. He stared out to the dark water and contemplated the offer. Then before I could speak, he kissed me again and shut me up. He contemplated the sea now, a glittering sheet of silver lame that stretches back to the past. It must be strange for him to see the Pacific once more, so long hidden from him in Texas, the ocean a reminder of that terrible flight from that crowded boat full of refugees from Saigon. He relives it all at once. He sees the small of his mother's back as she huddles her children in this corner of a dark and crowded and stinking hole. He wanted to take her place so that she could rise to the upper deck and smell the fresh air, even if only just once. But she never did. The journey, she kept her lioness vigilance over a sickly brood. It was him who begged for water, who gathered bad news. It was him who told them how blue the sky, how vast the sea. His siblings are grown now. His mother well past middle age and half crazed, and he, like a benevolent spirit, still needs to watch over her, over them, lest he somehow loses all purposes and meaning. Though he yearns for freedom, God only knows, a nightly defeat. He turns to me then, the wind in his hair, the sea a blur in the corner of his eye. I want to, I really do. Day 3, something has changed. A shadow has flown across my window, a movement in the stars. The initial delight of recognition shifts to the fact of too many details. We fall into routine. He sleeps on my favorite side of the bed. My left arm hurts from the weight of his handsome head. The way he throws the scarf over his shoulder vaguely bothers me, and I can't say why. Sometimes he has the sad look, a poet's melancholy, I suppose, and it's unreachable. He wears it too often, though, like a geisha, his powder. I look at him now insulated in sadness and wonder how his books could possibly fit in my apartment when my shelves have no more space for V.S. Naipaul's collected works. Day 4, he discovers an unfinished poem on my desk, an ode to his beauty. He says nothing, but I can tell he doesn't really like it. It's not jealousy, it's the fact that I have moved into his territory, even if to woo him. Something in his sigh I recognize too well is claustrophobia. Day 5, or rather night, rain, a chorus of remembrances. 15 years and he is tonight as he was then, a moist-eyed boy standing in a refugee camp watching his mother hugging her his sickly brother, her youngest pup dying of pneumonia before her eyes. He is drunk not from the alcohol, but from trusting and grief. He stares out the window and speaks of leaving, of wanting to leave, leaving his mother, which is impossible, leaving his siblings who have already left him, leaving Texas, which he didn't care for, leaving everything, his memory, his sadness, what owns him. We buried little Ben in Guam. Around the grave we stood and sang his favorite song, then left his plastic dog on the mound until the rain washed it away. My sister went back to look for the grave last year, but she couldn't find it. Some morning, my mother stares out the window and cries as if it just happened last night. Listening to him, I suddenly am overwhelmed by a particular memory. It was summer of 1973, a year after the Arvin and the Americans recaptured the city of Quan Tri near the DMZ. I had visited with my father via helicopter, a rather strange excursion. The city was destroyed in the recapturing and reduced to piles of rubble by bombs that left deep holes after the monsoon turned into swimming pools for the children who survived. I walked about. Behind a broken window of a house sat an old woman. She sat as she must have always sat, with an ease of years, but she stared out to nothing now. The old neighborhood gone, and the wall that held her window was the only thing left standing of that old house. I remember waving to her. She did not wave back. Day 6, I want to tell him, the angel sleeping on my shoulder, that it's strange how love between two exiles can be thwarted by the hunger of memories, that Vietnam remains in many ways an unfinished country between us, even now, body to body, lips to lips. Day 7, she needs me, he says, you're lucky, you're free, and therefore, I thought, utterly alone. On the way home from the airport, it suddenly occurs to me how the tiny shard came to be there on my floor. A thin crystal vase that held a dozen white tulips toppled over one windy evening last spring. I remember holding the flowers upside down, drunk and out of breath, a lake of sharp crystals lapsing at my feet, water dripping from the grieving bulbs like melted snow. A month and still no news. His phone is disconnected. This morning, I found the wrinkled tissue dotted with dry blood under my bed, my own shroud of Turin. He is so far away now, hidden across time zones, cocooned in requiems. I walk barefoot in my apartment, hoping another shard would pierce me too. But I'm not made for such a thing, alas, and must resort to keeping under my cool blue satin pillow the blood-stained tissue, remnant of an uneasy dream of communion whose yearning is long.
Wow. Well, I have to, that is one of the when it was a manuscript, or at least not published yet. I think you did send it off to me, and so that was kind of a flashback for me too. It's fascinating that it bookends our conversation so beautifully, and you might have intended that, but that's part of what I heard.
Yeah.
Given that we first started talking about your very first affair, and then this is
definitely not the first
of a much later and no doubt fictional affair. Thank you so much for the beautiful reading, and I'm always swept away, to be honest, by the sensuousness of your writing. Since you did write that one a few years ago, do you hear your stories differently from a distance than in the sort of heat of writing them at the time? Do they change for you?
Well, not when they're kind of like so this, I don't know, has this inner rhythm. So when I read them, I hear them again.
Yeah, I can hear you hearing it. In fact, I feel like I can hear.
Yeah, I haven't read it out loud for a long time. But when I read it, it brings back all this memory of having written it, and it feels like a kind of like time travel for me, because it's been a long time since I published that story, or actually I wrote that story. So.
Yeah, and it occurs to me another question I never asked you, and I don't know, this might be a question that has no resonance with you, but since you had such an amazing career in radio, and millions of people across the United States kind of recognize your voice from NPR.
Yeah.
there is this interesting thing about the voice of radio, which is very present, and then the
Yeah.
voice that we talk of as writers.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't know if you think your radio voice ever influenced your writing or not. I mean, it's not something, actually, it's not something that had occurred to me before.
Yeah.
But since I was sitting here thinking, I read that piece
Yeah.
in manuscript, right? So
Yeah.
I didn't have Andrew Lamb reading it to me.
Yeah.
And
it's a difference
really
though, right? When you read it
I
and you
loved
hear
it.
the
I still
author
remember
read.
it vividly, but it was, I mean, I felt like, wow, it's even better listening to you actually read it in your own voice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I definitely am more aware of cadence and local voices because of radio. Because when you read something too fast or when you fail to announce certain words, the producer would stop you and say you mispronounced it or you swallowed that word, right? And so you're much more aware of the musicality, and the intonation of language. So it certainly influenced my writing for sure, especially in conversations and so on.
Yeah. And then just because I happen to think of this question in terms of influences, we're running 1 minute over, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Because I was going to mention that, again, because you were from an upper class family, and also because Vietnam has a deep, deep, deep literary tradition.
Yeah.
And then you were schooled in French, which has a deep, deep, deep literary tradition.
Yeah.
So do you feel like there's elements of French literature or Vietnamese literature in your voice as an American writer? Do you feel those other
definitely
winds in there?
Yeah, because I grew up with very literary parents who were educated both in French and Vietnamese, especially my father, who actually had a French philosophy degree. So and had loved
secretly wanted to be a writer. Isn't that part of it?
Yeah, and he actually published a memoir. So it definitely influenced. I think the French Romanticism and the Vietnamese Romanticism kind of work in sync with each other. And I think in some way they inform my writing, even if I'm not so conscious of it. So definitely there is both the French and Vietnamese influence in my writing at all time, really.
Oh, where are the snows of yesteryear? For the French lit students. All right, and thank you again you're always so generous with your time with us. You didn't have to ride the Caltrain this time, and we didn't have to find someone to
listen. I miss interacting with people though. I mean, I've done, last year I did of all time the Library of Congress via Zoom. I had always wanted to be invited, and finally I'm invited.
Really? Yes.
And it was Zoom. You know what I mean?
Not that one, yeah. Like, oh, please.
So it feels different when you don't know who's where and you don't see faces and you don't have the energy feedback from the audience. You know what I mean? So I can't wait for this thing to be over so that I can interact with people again.
Yeah, although I'll say, since I've hosted you so many times at Foothill College and come to many of your readings in the city. What's interesting to me, I was even thinking about this as you're reading, because in the Zoom, like you get the big close-up, right?
Yeah.
Like you're on the big screen, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a strange intimacy to Zoom. And also I really do think, because you have a career in radio and so much experience, that your ability to project emotion and color and touch and feel and scent, it's in your writing, but it is also in your voice. So I was in a way, I was feeling like, wow, there's something still very intimate about a reading, even though we're 1,000 miles away and I'm in Denver and you're in San Francisco. Everyone else is God knows where in the Zoom world. So I will just, maybe I'll end by just thanking you, because the reading was really a powerful one for me. And again, having read it on the page, I will still prefer to have Andrew Lamb read it to me, not quite in person, but about as close as we're going to get in pandemic land.
Well, thank you. It was fun. Yeah,
and I wish you a safe return to Vietnam sometime soon. You have 2 homes.
Yeah.
So I know you'll always be coming back to San Francisco, and we'll look forward to having you either via Zoom or live in person on the campus at Foothill College.